Her true story from Florida. My daughter-in-law laughed and said, "You don't belong here anymore," and moved her parents in. So I returned the next day with the buyer. She redecorated my home. I erased her name from the deed. "You're nothing but dead weight and we've had enough. I'm moving my parents in, so pack your things and get out." My daughter-in-law's voice sliced through the air like the slap she probably wished she could have given me. She stood in the center of the kitchen with one manicured hand on her hip, the other pointing toward the hallway. "And don't act surprised. You've been freeloading for long enough." I blinked, unsure if I had heard correctly. "Freeloading," I managed to whisper the word, catching on the edge of my dry throat. She stepped closer, a cruel smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "You should understand. You've served your purpose. You're done here." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I only looked at her, and then toward my son, who stood by the fridge holding a mug of coffee, like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the room. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Jacob," I asked softly, but he said nothing, not even a shrug, just turned slightly so I couldn't see his face. And that was when she spat. Yes, spat right onto my chest. It landed on the collar of my blouse, a blouse I had ironed just this morning. She laughed. "That's about what your worth is now, Granny." I gasped, and for a moment my hand hovered near my chest, like it could wipe away not just the spit, but the humiliation burning through my skin. But I didn't cry. I reached for my suitcase, the one I always kept half-packed, just in case we ever had to evacuate for hurricanes. Florida's funny that way. One day it's paradise, the next it's blowing you away. My hands trembled as I zipped it shut. I could hear her on the phone in the other room. "Yes, Mom. We'll have your room ready. Don't worry." The old lady's finally leaving. My legs felt like they were made of stone. Every step toward the front door was an act of will-not movement. I felt like I was dragging the weight of my own grave behind me. I stood on the porch as the sun began to dip low, casting golden shadows on the boards I had helped paint last summer. The suitcase thudded softly on the wood as I lowered it beside the lounge chair. It was the same chair I used to rock my grandson to sleep in when he was small and feverish. Now I was the one who felt sick. No room left in the house, she had said, every space taken. Her parents needed comfort. I was an inconvenience. I sat down slowly, feeling each joint creak, like the rusted hinges of the porch gate. The air smelled like jasmine. That was my plant. I had raised it from a sprig no bigger than a pinky. I looked back at the door, half expecting it to open, half hoping my son would come out and say this was all a mistake. He never did. Instead, I heard laughter. Hers. And then the blinds shut. The mosquitoes started to bite as twilight settled in. I wrapped my arms around myself. The thin cardigan I wore no match for the Florida chill that comes when you least expect it. I didn't sleep that night. I rested, but not like someone who had peace. Like someone trying to remember what peace once felt like. I thought about my husband. He had passed 5 years earlier, a quiet man with strong hands and a gentle heart. I wondered what he would have said. Probably nothing. He was like me that way. We weren't yellers. We endured until we didn't. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I stood and walked the perimeter of the porch. I touched the column where my grandson had drawn a smiley face in crayon years ago, still faintly visible. I walked to the side garden. My roses were blooming again, though nobody had pruned them since me. I bent down and picked one, a single bloom red velvet. I sat again and held it like it could remind me who I was. Not a burden, not a dead weight, not a placeholder for someone else's in-laws. I was the woman who paid the first down payment on this house. I was the one who suggested that wall be knocked down to open the kitchen. I was the one who stayed up with a crying baby while my daughter-in-law got her nails done or went to yoga. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who sent cards, who made sure no one ever came home to an empty table. And now I was sleeping on the porch because there was no room left. That morning, just before dawn, I walked down the steps and stood in the driveway. The dew had gathered on my sandals. I looked at the windows of the house, my house still legally mine in more ways than they knew. And I made a decision, not out of anger, out of clarity, because I may have slept outside like a stray dog, but I still remembered where the leash was, and the key, and the deed, and the name that was still on it, mine. They didn't know what was coming, but I did. Because when you've been told you don't belong in your own home, there's only one thing left to do. Remind them who gave it to them in the first place. It started with a dream, not mine. At least not at first. It was Jacob's dream. And I remember the day he sat across from me in the tiny screened-in porch of my retirement condo and said, "Mom, we're thinking of building a house, something permanent, a home where the kids can grow up and stay grounded." I had just poured him a glass of sweet tea, The ice clinked in the glass as he spoke. I looked at his eyes, hopeful, bright, and I saw the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them roses. I smiled. Tell me what you're imagining. They wanted something spacious, airy room for the kids, room for visitors, a wraparound porch, an open kitchen, a garden, a home with light and warmth and future. And I, old as I was, 73 at the time, had savings from my years as a dental assistant and the modest sale of my little retirement condo. I'll help, I said. He hesitated. Mom, I didn't mean, I know I said, but you're building a legacy. I'd be proud to be a part of it. And I meant it. So I signed over the condo, took that check and deposited it into the joint account Jacob had set up for the build. You'll always have a room, he promised. You'll be part of the home, Mom. This is for all of us. His wife Camilla smiled politely, then said, thank you, and suggested I could design the garden if I wanted. I did more than that. I helped pick the tile for the kitchen, Silas blue that reminded me of the Gulf. I found the perfect local carpenter who hand-laid the wooden floors plank by plank, just like my father once did. I stood in the July heat, helping lay bricks for the flower beds. Even when my hands ached so badly, I could barely lift my coffee the next morning. When the roof beams went up, I stood in the shade and wept. Not because of the beauty of the home, though it was beautiful, but because it was mine too. Not legally, maybe, but in blood, in intention. When the nursery was painted, I hung a framed cross-stitch I had made years ago that said, "This house shall hold love." I had it embroidered for my own wedding. It followed me everywhere. They let me place it above the rocking chair in the corner next to the window. And when the baby was born, my granddaughter Lily, they named the second guest room after me. Granny's room, they said. I believed I would grow old there, that we would have Sunday suppers and weekday movie nights, that when I was too frail to travel, my home would be the place everyone came to. But slowly, like a trickle before a flood, things began to shift. It started when Camilla's parents began visiting more often. They were loud, demanding. "Why doesn't this room have blackout curtains?" her mother once said, frowning at the guest room. Then came the suggestion that I move my things into the basement to make room for the in-laws when they visit. That was the beginning. The cross-stitch disappeared from the nursery. The granny's room label was quietly removed from the door. My framed family photos were taken down from the hallway wall. When I asked, Camilla smiled. "Oh, we're just redecorating. Don't worry, we'll find a special place for your things." They never did. I began eating alone in the sunroom. They claimed it was easier to manage the kids without too many adults crowding the table. I was no longer consulted about house repairs or groceries. Once I offered to bake cookies for Lily's birthday, Camilla said, "We ordered from Whole Foods, but you can help wash up afterward if you want." And suddenly, the dream house I helped build, the one I gave my retirement for, became a place where I was treated like a ghost. Not hated, not shouted at, just quietly erased until one day, I stood in the garden. My garden, and realized I had not touched a single plant in 3 months. Camilla's mother had hired a landscaper. "Let's get some real design going," she had said with a laugh. I watched him pull up the lavender I had raised from seed, and that was the moment I realized this house I helped build was no longer mine. Not even a little. I was no longer part of the foundation. I was the unwanted reminder of how it got started. The legacy I dreamed of was not it was leverage, and I was no longer needed. They had the house, but they forgot I still had the land. It happened slowly at first, like paint drying in the sun, barely noticeable until you glance back and realize everything has changed. It began with the walls. One Friday morning, I woke to the sound of scraping and scraping upstairs. I leaned over the balcony, and there she was, my daughter-in-law Camilla, standing on a stool with a paint roller in hand, slathering over the soft sage walls we had chosen together with a bold eggshell white. The sage felt warm, inviting what I had chosen, and she was erasing it. I wanted to stop her, say, "That was my pick," but I paused. Instead, I whispered, "It looks brighter." She flashed me a cool smile. I wanted something modern, brighter, future-looking, not old lady. Future-looking, not old lady. That was me. Now next came the altar. My husband's photo, the small Buddha statue, the candles. We had placed them on the special shelf in the dining room, part prayer, part memory. But one morning they were gone. I asked Camilla about them while clearing the breakfast plates. "Oh, we wanted a clean line in this room," she said. "We donated that stuff." She said it as if I might donate my own house next. Inside, my heart tightened. I reached for her hand. It was important to me. She let go like I was on fire. "It's not needed," she said. "We're donating it. Later, I discovered the altarpieces at the thrift store. They had sold them. I recognized my Buddha statue in someone else's garden the next week. And then that tea set, the one I'd inherited from my mother, painted pale blue with hand-painted daisies. I brought it out on my granddaughter's 12th birthday. Can I keep just one cup? I asked quietly. Camilla looked at it and scoffed. That tacky old set. You want to keep it? No, Mom. I'm getting a new Pottery Barn set today. That one's going. Her words landed like an axe. Tacky old set. I closed my mouth. Instead, I nodded, carefully lifted the cup, wrapped it in tissue, and slipped it into my purse for safekeeping. That night, I sat alone on the back porch, the old cup resting beside me. I traced its handle, thinking of my mother pouring morning coffee under this very porch roof when I was a child. The air smelled of honeysuckle. I pressed my palm to my chest. My breath trembled, quiet, deep. Old woman tremors pulled straight from the years I spent building this family. Soon the garden became unused. Camilla had landscapers come. She picked out expensive designer plants that thrived in suburban barren soil, not heirloom tomatoes I'd planted for fresh salsa. My rosemary, my lavender, my cherry tomato bushes, they were gone. I love that clean line, she said in passing as if talking about furniture. She removed the planters I had painted. She covered the garden with stone. My vegetables replaced with monochrome turf, bright green artificial perfection. Inside, they began selling off more things, a bookshelf filled with my old textbooks. Florida history quilting patterns, bird-watching guides gone. She told me she'd upcycled them for Halloween decorations. I later found them shredded in a craft box. I tried to speak, but Camilla said, "You'll have to speak up. We have a vision without me." The final blow came one morning just 2 weeks later, when I walked into the living room and saw the framed wedding photo my husband and me in youth now missing. In its place was a blank wall with a minimalist photo of Camilla's parents. When asked, she said, "Mom and Dad belong there now." I felt too tired for confrontation. Instead, I wandered upstairs, found my old jewelry box with decades of family photos and slipped them into a drawer. I'd been trying not to cry in front of my grandchildren. I did not want to scare them or shame them because they were sweet, impressionable. I wanted them to know truth without making them feel torn. The next day at breakfast, my granddaughter said, "Granny, can you tell me about this?" she asked, pointing to a worn photo of our old house where Lily was learning to ride her bike. Of course, I smiled. Camilla overheard and said with sharp edge, "That's a conversation for our history lessons, not during waffles. Choose better moments." I held my tongue. Months passed and the shifts grew more obvious. My requests for weekend visits to the hardware store were met with rolled eyes. One night, watching television, I reached over to adjust the throw blanket and found Camilla had removed the heart pattern quilt I'd made her wedding gift. It was gone. I asked her about it the next morning. "Oh, I donated it to Habitat. I thought it would help someone more than it helps us." And that was that. Once I thought I was building a home, a legacy, a place for my blood and my stories. Now I was a housekeeper in someone's dream. One bright July afternoon, I quietly packed a cardboard box. Inside, I placed the last photograph of William and me, our wedding day. Smiles, my mother's heirloom teacup. The additional cup I'd brought downstairs with me, a small sprig of rosemary from the corner herb garden, a handwritten recipe for my daughter-in-law's favorite oatmeal cookies. I folded the box and taped it closed. I wrote on it for Lily. That evening, I gave it to my granddaughter after dinner, just handed it across the table. She looked puzzled. She opened it. Inside were the things. She looked up at me, eyes wide. "Granny, all these are yours." "They were." I nodded. "They were. And now they're yours." She hugged me around the waist. I hugged her back tight. Camilla cleared her throat. "We're going to start organizing donations," she said. "Granny's things just piled up." But Lily squeaked. "No, we found Granny's box. It's important." Camilla gave an exasperated sigh and walked away. That night, as I sat on my bed, I touched the empty walls, the bare memories. The house looked perfect, minimal, clean lines, Pottery Barn reality, but inside me the weight clanged. I closed my eyes and remembered laying bricks for our flower beds, choosing the porch light with my husband, sanding the floors until they glowed. I remembered polishing the kitchen counter until it reflected my face. Now everything was rearranged without me, like I had never been part of it. I turned away from the barren wall and whispered to the night. This was my home, my love, my labor, and maybe not mine legally, but mine in every worth that matters. The next morning, I quietly left. No confrontation, no harsh words, just a suitcase, a handbag, and a deep, slow, steady breath. I locked the front door behind me and for the first time felt relief in the click of my own thumb turning the key. It was after her parents moved in that I slowly began to realize I no longer belonged, not just in my son's house, but in my own life. They started with small things, a shift in how I was addressed, the way doors closed behind me instead of opened, the way weekends became filled with laundry and errands, not with conversation. One Monday, I folded towels in the laundry room when my daughter-in-law came down the stairs. She was wearing a crisp blouse, aside from the casual tone she used as she passed me. "We really do need this room for Grandpa and Grandma," she said. "If Granny could take the porch, that would be best." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I realized I had no choice. That evening, I set up my suitcase in the laundry closet, stacked neatly beside detergent and cleaning rags. They installed a curtain as privacy, a modest folding chair, and a lamp. The basement bedroom where I had lived once felt empty and distant. Now I felt I didn't even deserve a proper room. On the night I slept outside, it was the coldest night I had ever known. Florida winters are mild, so mild that you never expect December to feel like the breath of an exhale, but the air settled like glass through the empty spaces of the house. I wrapped my threadbare blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat on the porch bench, the same bench I had painted white with my granddaughter 2 years earlier. She had wanted horseshoes and rainbows. I had painted it simply hoping it would last, and it had. I did not cry. Maybe my smile had dried up earlier, back when the breakfast nook became a snack bar for the in-laws. Maybe it had gone missing when my picture disappeared from the living room wall. I just sat. The night sky above me was dark. The porch light glowed weakly, but it was enough. I thought of my husband, the way he used to walk me out to this porch, call me his moonbeam, and sit with me as the clock ticked after midnight. I thought of my grandchildren, the way they built pillow forts under this roof, the smell of hot cocoa on cold mornings. I thought of the erosion piece by piece of my place in their lives, not because they had begun to dislike me, but because they had decided I was no longer useful. A whisper came through the screen, a neighbor's cat perhaps. I drew the blanket tighter and listened to the rhythm of the night. Leaves rattling, the distant hum of a car, the crackle of radio static drifting from a nearby yard. I tried to sleep. Cobbled dreams of home flickered in my mind. Home, not a house. Home meant warmth, meant belonging, meant being more than an accessory. I drifted into a half-leap around midnight. The cold seeped into my bones. My younger body would have laughed at weather like this, but this older body felt it unlisted in her description. I woke around 2 shivering. Everything akshdi, the bones in my shoulders, my spine, my knees. I hugged myself tightly, rocking slightly to emulate a hug, a failed attempt, until I just stayed still. By 3, I felt the first moisture of tears on my cheek, but I didn't let them fall. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Mama, I did my best." The night wound on long and slow, longer than any hurricane watch I had weathered. It was as though time had stretched itself deliberately just to watch me sit there and stay. Morning came, very low and hazy mist wrapping the yard in wool. I opened my eyes to that soft light gray as ash, filled with a quiet that no longer demanded my eyes stay open. I stood. My body trembled with chills, my suitcase still at my feet. I picked it up. No tears, just a shudder of bones. I walked across the porch and looked back one last time. The door I had locked the night before, the one I thought I had lost, felt like a ghost echo of a life that was once mine. I did not speak. I did not cry. I only walked. I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching under my slippers. I did not look back again. The air smelled cold. It tasted clear. I carried with me the echoes of every Sunday dinner, every birthday wish, every whispered bedtime blessing. And I carried a certainty. My place was no longer in this house, but somewhere else. Someone would need me, and I would find them. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I decided to go through the old files I had stored in the bottom of my suitcase. I had kept them tucked away just in case. The zipper stuck a little, the metal catching on fabric, but I finally pulled it open. There, beneath folded sweaters and 2 photo albums, lay the folder labeled in my late husband's handwriting, property, Florida, 2006. My heart beat a little faster. I opened it gently. The pages were yellowing, but the ink still spoke clearly. The land deed, the purchase agreement, my name on every line. The land where the house stood was entirely, indisputably mine. I scanned every document twice. Nowhere had I relinquished my ownership. Nowhere had I signed it over. My name was listed as a sole proprietor. The house, Camilla's prized, redecorated, sterilized house, had been built atop land that never belonged to her. Not in name, not in law, not in right. They had never transferred the land title, never applied for a formal separation of lot and structure. They had assumed that because I was quiet, I was powerless. But that land had always been mine, and suddenly the silence I had carried with me took on a new tone, not weakness but strategy. I sat back in my chair, let the Florida sun warm my lap, and allowed myself for the first time in weeks to smile. Not a bitter smile, not even vengeful, a smile of recognition, a smile of return. I made one phone call to Harold Jennings, an old friend from high school. We had lost touch after graduation, but he had stayed in Florida. Made a name for himself in real estate development. I still had his number tucked in the back of an address book I used more out of habit than need. He answered on the second ring. Ruth Hamilton from Roosevelt High. Yes, I said, laughing at how startled he sounded. I still remember your handwriting on the yearbook. We talked for 10 minutes, not about the past, but about the present. I told him I needed someone I could trust. I told him what had happened. I told him the house wasn't on the market, but the land was. Harold asked for the address and parcel number. I had it ready. He promised to run a valuation and get back to me by Friday. I didn't mention a word to my son or Camila. Not when I passed them in the hallway. Not when I overheard her on the phone telling a friend they were planning to build a gazebo for her parents' anniversary. Not when she moved the rose bushes I had planted, ripping them out like weeds. No, I waited quiet as breath. That week Harold came by. He wore a brown suit and carried a small leather folio. We sat at a diner not far from the property. He was careful, respectful, not wanting to draw attention. After coffee and pie, he opened the folder and showed me the appraisal. Well, market value, he said, because of the location and because there's interest. I raised an eyebrow. Already? He smiled. I told 1 or 2 people. One made an offer. Cash immediate. I stared down at the number. I didn't gasp. I didn't shake. I simply nodded. Let's accept it, I said. Harold paused. And your family? They'll find out soon enough, I said. They told me I didn't belong. Now I'll help them mean it. I signed the papers that day. Ownership was never about noise. It was about the quiet strength of a woman who had been underestimated too long. And my land was ready to speak for me. The next morning I put on my best blue blouse, the one with pearl buttons, and pressed my hair into soft curls. I wore lipstick too, a soft red, dignity even in endings. I met Harold and the buyer at the edge of the driveway. He held a leather portfolio. She, a young woman in her 30s, carried a clipboard, and we walked up the porch steps together. Camilla opened the door, her phone in one hand, a coffee in the other. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, then flicked toward Harold and the woman. What's going on? She asked. I stepped inside without asking. Harold followed, nodding politely. We're here for the final walkthrough. Camilla blinked. Final what? She turned to me. Mom, what's this about? I took the portfolio from Harold, pulled out the documents, and laid them gently on the dining room table. Her pristine table with coasters that matched the curtains. I pointed to the clause printed clearly on the second page. This house, I said calmly, sits on land I've owned since 2006. It was never transferred. It was never gifted. It was never yours. Her coffee trembled slightly in her hand. You're kidding. No, I said. I'm not. She stepped forward. You can't. I looked her in the eye, firm and unshaken. I can. And I have, Harold added. The transaction was finalized yesterday. The land has a new owner. The house sits on it, and now it must be vacated. Camilla laughed, a high, panicked sound. This is illegal. You can't do this. I'll call the police. You may, I said, and she did. 10 minutes later, 2 officers stood on the porch. She waved them inside like knights. This woman is trying to evict us from our own home. The officer turned to me. Ma'am, do you have documentation? I handed him the deed, the transfer documents, the certified letter of notice. His eyes scanned the paper. Then he looked at Camilla. Ma'am, he said gently, this land no longer belongs to you. Legally, this is her property. The buyer has every right to request that you vacate. Camilla's face fell. She looked at my son, who had just entered the room, blur-eyed and confused. He asked, What is going on? I sold the land, I told him simply, and this house was never yours. Not fully. You all forgot that. He whispered something under his breath. Camilla began to cry. I stood still. No victory dance. No cruel smile, just presence. You wanted me out, I said. Now it's your turn. There was no shouting, only the sound of a chair being pulled out, of paper being folded, of consequences finally showing up to dinner. The buyer began taking photos. Harold reviewed the checklist. I turned toward the door, not because I was finished, but because I had already begun a new life the moment they pushed me aside, and now the house followed. The papers were signed, the keys handed over, and the echoes of their protests had faded. The house once mine in silence had been spoken for out loud, but the ending was softer than anyone might have expected. The buyer turned out to be more than just a young investor. She was the director of a nonprofit organization that transformed underutilized homes into community spaces for elderly women who had been displaced, forgotten grandmothers, widows without pensions, caregivers left behind. The name of her group was Haven Hearth, and their mission was exactly what I had needed months ago to make sure no older woman ever had to sleep on a porch again. When she looked me in the eye that day and said, "We would love to have you stay, Miss Hamilton, as an honorary advisor, someone to help us shape the space." I felt the sting of the offer, not because it hurt, but because it was kind. Kindness in the ruins of cruelty feels almost foreign. I thanked her gently and declined. I think it is time I lived in a place where no one calls me too much, not even with their silence. She nodded, understanding. I found a small apartment 3 blocks from the water. It was nothing grand, just 2 rooms, a little balcony, and a patch of sunlight that hit the east wall every morning like a kiss. I painted the walls myself. I bought a used bookshelf. I filled it not with frames of people who had forgotten me, but with novels I never had time to finish, poetry I had once taught in classrooms, and blank journals for the days still coming. I named every plant on the balcony. My favorite was a stubborn hibiscus I called Gloria. She bloomed late but beautifully. Every afternoon I sat in a wicker chair, facing the ocean, reading slowly, sipping chamomile tea. I watched the tides come and go like memories, some crashing, others gentle. I learned that peace is not what remains after war. It is what you grow when you stop waiting for someone to apologize. The house. I drove past it once about 3 months later. There was a garden now where the rose bushes used to be. The front door was painted a softer color. I saw older women coming out onto the porch with knitting bags, card decks. One holding a sketch pad. One waved at a little girl walking her dog. It did not sting. In fact, I felt proud. The house was finally being used for what it was meant to be, not a stage for power, but a space for care. They had removed my family's name from the mailbox. That was fine because the house had once been my dream. Then it became my burden. And now it was a message. A message that some legacies do not live in names. They live in decisions. I left behind no framed portraits, no embroidered pillows, no heirlooms nailed to the walls. I left behind a lesson, a quiet, firm one. If you choose to forget who built the foundation, do not be surprised when it disappears from under your feet. And me, I found that the air near the sea held something I had not breathed in years. Freedom. The message came at 6:42 in the morning. I was watering the succulents on my balcony, a ritual I had adopted like breathing. Soft light was rising off the ocean, the sky painting itself into clarity. My tea steeped in a chipped ceramic cup beside me, its steam curling up like memory. The phone buzzed once. Then again I sat down, wiped my hands on my robe, and read the screen. "Mom, please forgive Camilla. She didn't mean what she said. None of us knew how much the house meant to you. It doesn't feel like a home without you. Come back." I stared at the words for a long time. The sun had risen a little higher by the time I replied. "I didn't leave because of the house. I left because none of you remembered who built it." I set the phone down and didn't wait for a reply. That was the difference now. I didn't wait anymore. There was no longer a door I had to knock on to be allowed inside. No longer a chair I had to ask to sit in. No longer a kitchen I tiptoed through, afraid of stepping wrong in a space I helped create. This apartment, small as it was mine in every way that mattered. The pantry was stocked with things I liked. Strawberry jam, black tea, lentils I cooked slowly every Sunday. The walls bore no accusations, only art. I had framed a photo of my mother and pinned it beside the window. Her eyes, frozen in a sepia smile, looked out toward the waves. I had bought a wind chime, a soft wooden one that only sang when the breeze was just right. That was enough. There was no plaque with my name on it. But I didn't need one because here I was, not a tenant in someone else's life. Here I belonged without asking. Some nights I still remembered the cold of that porch, the silence, the disbelief the moment I realized I had become an accessory in the lives of those I once centered. But I no longer cried for that woman. I honored her. I lit candles for her every Wednesday. I wrote her letters in my journal. I thanked her for staying silent when silence was the only shield she had. And I thanked her even more for finally speaking with action, with law, with grace. A neighbor visited one afternoon. Her name was Marlene. She was 72, wore headscarves with sequins, and smelled like cinnamon. "You always sit out here with that little smile," she said. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled at her. I'm thinking about the way peace feels when you no longer need someone to hand it to you. She nodded slowly. So you made it to the other side, huh? I did, I said. She reached for my hand. We held it for a while without talking. And in that stillness, I realized something. No courtroom, no signature, no eviction could have taught me. Belonging isn't granted. It's claimed. And once claimed, it doesn't have to be defended. Not with anger, not with begging, just with presence. That night, I poured myself a glass of lemonade, walked barefoot to the edge of the balcony, and whispered a thank you to the wind. Not to my son, not to Camilla, but to the girl I used to be. The one who bought that plot of land with hope, the one who raised a son with faith, the one who stood in the middle of a house she'd paid for and was told she stayed standing. And now she sat watching the ocean tea in hand, with no doors left to knock on, just the wide open air. And her name finally spoken only by herself without shame. If you've listened this far, I want to thank you. Not just for hearing my story, but for holding space for it. Too often, women like me, mothers, grandmothers, caregivers, are only remembered for what we gave, not for what we lost, not for what we learned. And certainly not for how we rose after the world decided we were no longer needed. But let me tell you something. There is no expiration date on dignity, no age limit on truth, and no one, not a husband, not a child, not a daughter-in-law, gets to rewrite your worth. If this story reminded you of someone you know or someone you used to be, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it. And if you want more real stories from women who've lived, lost, endured, and remembered stories that don't shout, but stay, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and come sit with me again sometime. Until then, remember this. You don't have to knock to belong in your own life. And revenge, well, sometimes it comes wrapped in peace, sealed with a deed, and delivered with a smile. I'll see you next time.